Hearing all of you, I thought about the question if people really are worried about surveillance or how they should. So let me ask all of you two questions. Firstly, should we be worried about surveillance, and why do you think so many people are not worried? Are they correct? I can start with you, David Kirkpatrick. My impression is that people don't change their behavior, as mentioned. They're not worried about everything's happened after the Snowden revelations and so on. And do they think they're right not to be worried?
Well, actually, there is data that some people, I think 15% of Americans recently said they had changed their surfing behavior post-Snowden. Right now, my own personal opinion is we don't have too much to be worried about, but my opinion also is that it's very possible that in the not distant future we could have very good cause to worry. And I wanted to just clarify and complete maybe the thoughts that I had when I was up there, because the thing I really wanted to convey is that the global unitary nature of the internet is probably the central reason it has become so important. And to the degree we fragment the internet and allow it to become something different in each country is to the degree we reduce its capacity to bring the global benefits that we think are possible from it. And when I hear people say, governments necessarily, inevitably are going to regulate it further, the thing that comes to my mind is that there are majority of governments are way less enlightened than the one you have here in Norway. You happen to have the privilege and the luxury, as I do, of living in a country that more or less values privacy and personal freedom and really does believe in democracy. And unfortunately, that's not the prevailing view in the world today. And I think one of the most disturbing things that came out of the Snowden affair is that, once countries around the world saw that the United States did not really have the protections that we thought they had in terms of what could or could not be used, what could or could not be done with the data generated by the internet, the fact that the US was intruding has now been used by every non-democratic country in the world to justify their own intrusions. And the further democratic countries go down the road, and it's typically done in the name of preventing terrorism, of allowing intrusions, what we just have to be clear-eyed and realistic about is that those exact same justifications will be used by non-democratic governments for things that are truly reprehensible. So at that point, which I think is quite possible, there will be very good reason to worry.
Berit Svendsen, I could maybe change the question a little bit and asking, is it a good thing for Telenor that people are not so worried about surveillance and data registrations and so on?
I think there is an increasing concern amongst our customers to care more about taking control of their own data. And surveillance that are being used for prevent terrorism and criminal cases, that is a good thing for everybody. So lawful interception and the government taking out data from the networks in Norway are actually being used to prevent or try to find out about criminal cases. When this is said, I think we need more transparency around what is going on, because we all know that the NSA in the United States are storing a lot of data about us. I think we should have a requirement that we should get insight as individuals into those data. What are they being used for and why are they stored there? So we need transparency. We need to be open about it. The governments all over the world need to be open. I think that's the way forward. If we are not open about it, we don't trust our own governments. We don't trust the service providers.
Eirik Newth, could you elaborate a bit of why do you think that, some people change their behavior, but the vast majority don't, is my impression, and why do you think that is the case? Have they nothing to worry about?
Two reasons. Firstly, because modern mass surveillance is actually very unintrusive. The fact is that all of you are delivering data all the time to databases, and yes, we now know that, for instance, American intelligence agencies have had access to some of these data, also on Europeans, but none of you noticed, because it's not done that way anymore. There's not another person sitting at the other end listening to your phone conversations, for instance. It's algorithms. It's automatic. So yes, it's regarded as non-intrusive, and on balance, it's more beneficial. The other reason is, and that was actually confirmed by John Oliver in a very interesting interview, it's on YouTube. He was talking to John Oliver, who is a talk show host and comedian, and he was mentioning his usual argument about all the data that the NSA has gathered over the years. He said, it's like the NSA is holding a gun to our collective heads. I think that's the term he used. And then he sort of backtracked and he said, well, I have to admit that it hasn't happened yet in a democratic society. I mean, yes, we're mentioning all these non-democratic countries, but we need to remember that we are not there are still a lot of democratic countries, and what we are lacking are good cases of this kind of surveillance actually leading to the horrible states that we are always being told they will lead to. And that's a problem. That's a problem for ordinary people, because they're always hearing that. If you have surveillance cameras on the street, that's a breach of your freedom. In what way? I don't feel less free. That's what people are saying. And yes, I'm traveling around the country and talking about privacy all the time. So I'm hearing this all the time, and I'm having a hard time saying, yeah, what's wrong about that? I'm not feeling constricted. I'm living my life as always. So yeah, I think it's based on experience, and if you want to argue against it, you actually have to present some cases. Now, there was a case that Snowden could have mentioned. That was the case of Richard Nixon, who actually used surveillance in a democratic society against his opponents, but Snowden forgot to mention it. So there are cases, but they are rare, and I think many people are aware of that.
I just want to mention that our next breakfast meeting is about, is democracy in decline? So that could also be a question about David Kirkpatrick. You wanted to join in?
Wanted to say I actually disagree with that, because even though it may be true about Norway and the United States, and I don't disagree in those contexts, it is not true in Turkey, Central Asia, Egypt, Vietnam, and many other countries where governments already are using these tools to tremendously repress speech and behavior. In Vietnam, bloggers are in prison. This is very common, this kind of thing.
Yeah, but I was talking about democratic countries, firstly. And secondly, are we putting the cart before the horse here? Because, of course, an undemocratic or repressive government, of course, it will use surveillance as a tool for repression. But what the argument has been is that surveillance will lead to repression. That's the case that has to be made. Yeah, but not that repression makes use of surveillance.
Just quickly, the problem is that governments in every country don't understand the technology well enough. And if you look at one of the debates in the United States right now about backdoors into existing technology, and this is especially as applied to Apple, which has put in much more sophisticated encryption post-Snowden. And the US government has been arguing that Apple ought not to continue using that encryption because sometimes the NSA or the CIA or the FBI might want to get a key and go in and play around. Well, the problem with that argument is that if the US allows that to happen, Vietnam and Egypt and Turkey and China and Russia will all also demand that same privilege. So you can't have it both ways. The problem with these systems is they're global systems.
Yeah, but then again, getting back to it, that doesn't, for a Norwegian, that Norwegian policies might lead to something in Vietnam. It actually doesn't concern them much, and that's my point. You have to argue from a Norwegian reality if you are going to convince Norwegians. Okay, I want to bring in Jarbekk. You work with this as a lawyer. What's your thoughts?
I just have to first comment on this because the international aspect even counts from a Norwegian point of view. We have, for instance, a lawyer in Norway who uses Facebook. Big surprise. What does he have as friends on Facebook? Yes, one of his clients. Who is that client? He's an Arab. Who is he? He's maybe a terrorist. Some countries think he is a terrorist. This is a Norwegian citizen lawyer. Quite respectable, as to my knowledge. But for some reason, he cannot longer enter into the United States. And why is that? Because we have this international Facebook, I guess this is the reason, showing that he has some kind of liaison with a person that the US government doesn't really want to have in their country. So what happens? We don't want his lawyer either, do we? And actually the American ambassador has tried to change this because everybody agrees he's the lawyer. There's no problem with the lawyer. Quite normal Norwegian lawyer. And the US US ambassador contacted the administration in Washington. And what's the response? I'm sorry, you can't enter because we have a computer here that says you can't. That's an algorithm. That's a real consequence for a Norwegian citizen. And I think we're going to see many more issues like this, because you can't delete these data traces. They're there, and they will stay there. Erasing data, wiping data is for beginners. It won't happen. And as we interact, I mean, if I was planning on taking work in Saudi Arabia, somewhere in Asia, I would actually go through, maybe it's a bit late, but I would really consider how is my public profile, and I would kind of maybe hope they don't know what I think at home or what I communicate. It's not that I'm saying something that I shouldn't, but it can be interpreted in ways that we don't see, and I think that's a big challenge.
I'm going to give the floor to you very quickly, Berit Svendsen, but I just want to make sure that I haven't ignored anyone. I haven't noticed anybody wanting to come forward and take the floor, but I once again urge you and remind you that you can take the floor if you want. Just give me a sign. Berit.
Can I just, I just remembered another example.
Sure.
I know of a teenager in Oslo who was traveling to US as an exchange student, and he was going to a rather conservative area in the US through a professional agency, of course. What do? They give him a nice family in the US, and before entering, they just Google him. And what do they find? They find that he has declared himself as an atheist. On Facebook. Now this is a problem, and he gets a note from this agency saying that might not be such a good idea, because you know you're going to a very Christian society and you declaring yourself as an atheist might be difficult. Now that case didn't come to anything, but the global issue is highly important. Sorry.
I'm back to that. The United States should be more transparent about what are they doing with the data and how much data are they storing and to what purpose. And it's not something new that they prevent people from going into the United States. I remember when I was younger and we got those notes that we have to fill in before entering United States. If you were a communist or a Nazist, I think you haven't any chance to go in there. So there are nothing new that they prevent people going in. But the new thing is that they have those enormous amount of data that they combine in different ways and that we don't know about. I think that's the new thing. And they get a totally different overview than they had earlier, and it can get much bigger consequence because they combine everything that we don't know about.
David Kirkpatrick, I want to ask you, I mean, when people look at the internet, it's always difficult to get a grip on it. And I mean, if you look into the future, what do you see? How do you see that the internet as an infrastructure is going to develop?
Well, I think I've expressed my concerns that it could develop into a much less useful global system if we allow governments to get their hands on it. I mean, the great thing about ICANN is it's not a governmental organization. And one thing that is slightly important, that's very important, that was mentioned, that just to clarify, the ITU, which is an arm of the United Nations, was looking about 2 years ago as if it really was going to make an effort to take control of the internet away from ICANN, which would have been difficult to do, but they were going to try. And they were being driven by Russia and China and the UAE and a lot of other countries that are, and India even. But that has been pushed back, and at the moment that doesn't look likely to happen. I think ICANN, partly because ICANN has done a very good job reassuring people that it possibly could continue to do the job on its own. But I'm very worried. I would say, I just wanted to say one other thing, though, about this issue of the data that's used to identify our behavior. There's a good part to that, too, which is that there's too much data for them to really use effectively. And there's this concept that I really like called data exhaust. that there's and as the Internet of Things emerges, the quantity of data is going to explode even more, and it's going to get, just like Eric Schmidt likes to say, there's more data produced in 2 days than were produced in humankind up until 1990 or something like that. And in fact, that exponential acceleration is going to continue, so that in 5 years we'll be producing more data than we produced up until 2016 every 2 days. And the software is not going to be able to keep up with the quantity of information that's available to analyze, in my opinion. And in a sense, there's another notion that I happen to like a lot that applies to Facebook and other things, which is that there's this notion of anonymity by obscurity. That the more information there is, the less important any given piece of information is. And so if everything about all of us is always known, the chances of any one piece of that being used against us begins to diminish dramatically. So the fact that everybody buys porn maybe isn't so important to embarrass someone about, for example, or something like that. There's many ways of making that point, and I really think it's good that the quantity will always be greater than our ability to manage. So in the end, I remain optimistic about the future of the Internet and the future of our ability to operate within it.
Berit Svendsen.
I just want to respond on that Internet and fragmentation, because I'm a technology optimist. I've always been that. And Internet is close to 50 years, and it's one of the greatest innovations in newer times. It has created a different new worlds. I think one of the huge tasks going forward is to keep it as open as it has been up to now. And we can say a lot about the United States and lack of transparency regarding big data, but they have invented the whole thing. And they have created a great marketplace and a great freedom of speech arena that has, empowered society, empowered individuals in a fantastic way. And we need to keep that in mind when we talk about, all the bad things that are out there as well. Keep it open. That's a huge task going forward. And keep it as an open marketplace, available for everybody, and get people access to Internet everywhere. It's your thing.
Newth, before we open up for questions from the audience.
Yeah. I also find the idea of anonymity by obscurity, which is sort of analogous to security by obscurity. It's interesting, and it might very well become a truth. There's a book out there which can be recommended. It's called The Circle by an author called Dave Eggers. And it's a sort of humorous take on 1984, but in a modern context. It's the modern events. It's sort of Facebook on steroids. It's everybody knows everything about everyone else, and it's interesting because it's probably telling us more about how the internet society of the future will be than Orwell's 1984, which is much more a critique of Stalin's Soviet Union. Yes, I'm hoping that, the floor is open. Has the floor been open for a while?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I must say, I've been to these meetings and I watch you online, and I'm a bit disappointed but not surprised. Because this happens every time if you mention the internet and privacy, boom, it goes silent. And I know why. It's difficult and maybe you don't want, but please, have some questions. I said some really provocative things. Aren't you provoked? Please.
Well, maybe we have one brave soul sitting here. It's going to be the first one. And as Eric said, I urge you all to come forward if you have anything you want to raise. So, first.
Thank you. My name is Niels Breivik, and I did raise my finger before Newth.
That's good.
There's one element that hasn't really been touched upon so far, and that is the use of this internet by criminals, by siphoning off, for example, on transfers, international money transfers, banking, use of credit cards, blackmail, extortion. I am extremely worried about that, and using the internet for transferring money between different accounts to pay for. I have this uneasy feeling. I really lay myself open to now or in future to be exposed, to be used, and some day, like Monday morning, all my deposits are gone. That really worries me, and it worries me that the panel hasn't really touched upon this. You are touching about a lot of other things and what you can do for us. But don't take our money away.
So, the question is about the possibilities for criminals on the internet. I mean, it should probably be a good tool for criminals as well. Eva Jarbekk.
Well, I kind of meant to touch into that, but because money transfer and lots of other functions is one of the vital things that we have to make sure works in society. In addition to especially energy. If we don't have money and we don't have energy, we're rather lost. And somehow it turns out that electronic communication is vital for both of those two. And I think that is one of the big engines that is fueling country surveillance. And I can assure you that there are a lot of bureaucrats working on how to ensure your money. But they need to survey in order to be able to do that. And then, of course, there's the debate on how long can you store the logs that Telenor says that they need, but other bureaucrats say that they don't need. And if you ask a third bureaucrat in another department ministry, they will probably have a third opinion. Yeah.
Berit Svendsen, are the reason for the gentleman to be worried about if somebody going to take all this money? How secure would you say Telenor is working on this to make sure?
Now, of course, criminals are always a threat. And I think when they are using these same tools as all others on the internet, it can be that they can be a threat, but if they are using better tools than the government are allowed to use, it can be an even bigger threat because we are not able to catch them. So, of course, that's happening. And I think this is a requirement for the laws to speed up because the technology is moving very fast. And it's not only criminals, it's foreign countries that can take those tools into use that our own government are not able to use. So we have to think about that. And one thing I'm more worried about, to put it that way, is cyber attacks on Norway. That can put Norwegian critical infrastructure into black. It can totally set off the whole country. We will not be able to communicate. They can take the power supplies as well. If they do that during the winter, we will freeze. We are not able to use our payment cards in the shops. We don't have any currency anymore because the banks are closed. And we don't get health service. That can put us back in old-fashioned ways. So I think this is a much bigger threat than only criminals. But this can also be done by criminals. This can be done by foreign countries. And we have to be aware. And back to what Eva is saying, to have preparedness about that in Norway, to let government cooperate with the telcos, with everybody that has critical infrastructure, with the power companies. It's so essential. And when I read about the Minister of Justice last summer, he said that the denial of service attack on Norway was handled in a good way, but not fast enough. And that scares me, because that types of attack has to be handled in real time. If you don't stop them at the front, the border, sometimes I'm thinking in Spanish. It's not a good thing. At the frontier. At the border, you get a problem. And it has to happen in real time. And I don't think, to put it that way, that Norway is prepared for such a big attack. That's my concern, and that can be criminals, foreign countries as well.
David Kirkpatrick.
Well, 2 points. One is that I think to the degree we have a surveillance society already, I think we see public security and safety has improved dramatically. I mean, isn't it amazing how many crimes by stupid criminals are stopped and solved immediately these days by public security cameras? I mean, if you can't believe how idiotic these criminals are, that almost anything they do today is being recorded. And the police, too. Look at what's happening in Baltimore. The police didn't even realize that they're being captured captured on video when they're murdering this kid, you know? I mean, that's the world we're living in now, that in fact stupid people are getting caught much more easily. On the other hand, at the high end, with crime, it's always an arms race, and with digital crime, it's the greatest arms race. And smart criminals, which unfortunately still exist, and many of them are attacking us all the time, are succeeding within limits, but we are also constantly building our defenses against them. Now, the other point, though, I want to make is, again, we'll take an anti-governmental point here, because in reality, I'm more confident that technology itself will end up protecting us than governments will do that. And if you look at the potential innovations that blockchain and Bitcoin will represent to create new systems that really are, by the standards of today, very impregnable for things like our financial resources, I think it's quite possible that we will have digital currencies that are way easier to protect. But I will not count on government being the ones to build those systems, because those systems, the most reliable way we can think of doing it is completely bypassing government and creating these decentralized, highly secure systems like a blockchain-based ones. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to have more security for our financial behavior.
I've noticed 4 people wanting to come on the speakers list, so great, but remember we have to end within 9:30. I noticed you first, and then I also noticed you are sitting there, and next, and the woman behind you first.
Hi, my name is Anja Østgaard. I have a quick question about the privacy implications of the challenges to net neutrality. And then I'm referring to the Facebook introduced internet.org. What would the privacy implications be, or other implications?
So privacy implications of net neutrality on Facebook. David Kirkpatrick, you have any thoughts?
Well, there's been a lot of talk in the last 2 weeks about, particularly in India and in the United States, among generally, I think, technologically ignorant political activists, that internet.org represents a privacy threat to the users in the developing world, which I disagree with, simply because, in general, with people who have had no access to the internet up to now, to say that you shouldn't give them any access to the internet within limits because by doing so you're jeopardizing the privacy of their behavior, to me is a very condescending and elitist way of looking at the situation. So, you know, it is true, based as I understand it, and this has just come out in the last week, that the way that data is being treated by internet.org in developing countries where it operates in Africa and Southeast Asia is less secure. But for the people who are in the position of using that data, they are universally people who've never been on the internet before. So my opinion is it's probably better to let them, and Facebook claims they're going to try to improve the security of those systems, but there are challenges to doing that, and I don't know the technical reality there. But, you know, I think it's easy to get very alarmed about sort of subsidiary problems with some of these new systems, but on balance, anything that increases the number of people in the planet who are connected, to me, is a virtue.
Next from the speakers.
My name is Irene King. I have a question for David. I think I heard you saying from your earlier comment that we do not need, for now, to worry too much, but in a few years we have good cause to worry. Can you elaborate on that?
So the question is to David Kirkpatrick of what are the reasons for being worried in the future and not now?
Well, I think it depends on how the governmentally driven fragmentation of the internet grows, and it really depends on how worried we decide to be about terrorism, in my opinion. I personally don't think we should be quite as worried as we are. I think there are plenty of other virtues to security that would outweigh the potential risks that terrorists might be harder to catch. So, but I think that unfortunately, you know, if there were a major terrorist attack in the United States, for example, in the near future, which I don't think is impossible, I think you'd see the sentiment so dramatically shift towards protection of society that government would be given license to do literally anything it wanted. And then I'm afraid after that, that we would all be in greater jeopardy. That's my opinion.
Eirik Newth?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the things we've seen historically is that surveillance has been driven by events. That goes far. And emotion. So yeah, I mean, for instance, we've had previous scandals such as the Snowden revelations. For instance, you had the revelations from the 1960s and 70s in the United States that showed that the CIA and the NSA were actually surveying hundreds of thousands of Americans. Not in the same way as today, but based on the same principles. And that was driven by a real fear, the fear of communism, for instance. And yes, ISIS is definitely in a position to drive us into those kinds of actions today. And we need to be aware of that also when we talk about surveillance in Norway, because yes, we've had the terrorist attack, but it wasn't a jihadist attack. It was a single person. If it had been something organized from abroad or within a bigger circle in Norway, we might have seen a different reaction than we saw, for instance, when it comes to legislation. We know that it can happen again here as well. We are vulnerable. Europe is vulnerable. And we have to be aware that these events drive politics in this area. And so this debate can change so rapidly. And that also goes to say that while people are, when you ask them in polls, that they are generally skeptical of surveillance, it's also pretty clear that this is not a very hard point of view. It's not hard, it's quite easy to move it when something dramatic happens. And that's a big challenge, because it's probably going to happen.
Just quickly, the statistics showed that after the Snowden revelation, something like 65% of Americans opposed NSA surveillance. Now, with ISIS in the news and all this other stuff, that number has dropped down to like 30% or under 30%. So it's exactly what you're saying.
Eva Jarbekk, let me ask you, I mean, after 22nd of July in Norway, I mean, which was a really profound impact in Norway, I mean, it hasn't been that much discussion or politicians wanting to raise the level of surveillance, or what is your view? If we have tackled that situation quite well, haven't we?
I think that's a yes and a no. I think you will find many people saying that the police should have stopped him before. And I think that there are quite a number of police officers who feel that they are not made responsible, but that's a large number of people say that they should have stopped him.
But that wasn't because of lack of surveillance, was it? They had
they had information. He had been buying this kind of material and that kind of material, and if you put it together, if you big data it, 2 and 2 suddenly turns out to be 5. I think this is one of the reasons that you see a drift towards more surveillance in the police and the military sector. It's largely driven by the fear of terrorism in the military sector and the police sector. But I think it's that's manageable in a way. I think it's very important that we have good democratic discussions, that we have legislation that is well debated, because there are pros and there are cons to almost anything. And technology is difficult, and I think it's an important question. What are the real benefits of the surveillance that we are implementing? It is possible to say something on that, and it's very often based on feelings. And feelings is a very large element, but a very unstable element in these issues. And we are left with this legislation for many years. So we should do a good preparatory work.
Berit Svendsen, before we move on to the 2 last questions.
I think one thing is surveillance and getting a lot of data in from different customers and different views and survey everything. But the other thing is actually to use it when things happen. And that's about preparedness. I think 22nd of July was also about how prepared were we to handle the information that actually came into the police and the cooperation between the different units. So there are many more than just surveillance. You have to handle the data. And as David is saying, NSA has so much data, and they are probably not able to use it in an effective way.
Let me also ask you, before we move on to the 2 last questions, Berit Svendsen, there has been some discussions when Telenor invests abroad in regimes that are not exactly democratic. How do you view how the regimes maybe are going to use your technology to do surveillance and so on? There are probably some pro and contras here that you have some dilemmas.
Yeah, of course, it's a dilemma. it is a problem when you are going into countries that are not, seen as democratic as Norway and many Western countries. But what we have done now is to say that we will openly publish the lawful interceptions and how much data or how many times governments are asking for data from our networks. And if we go out and report that openly in a transparent manner, we mean that citizens can put pressure on the different governments. What are they using the data for? But this is a difficult dilemma.
Gentleman over there.
I would like to step back to something you said, David, about an event we certainly not would like to see happen, and that's if somebody created a cyber attack and took out the power or took out the communication, the money transfers, the healthcare, etc. But if I remember correctly, way back in 1963 or something, the internet or ARPANET was designed just to, counter that. I mean, that was the great design behind the internet, that if something is taken out, there will always be another network to replicate data. So what happened with technology in this respect?
So the question is about the internet and how it was designed. Maybe designed that it wasn't supposed to bring all things down together. No, David Kirkpatrick, what are your views? How vulnerable is the internet for real cyber attacks? How well prepared are, let's say, the Western countries?
We're vulnerable. One of the interesting things that I've heard, the Sony attack was a very noteworthy example of a we believe, state-sponsored attack on a company, which was extremely effective to the point that it stopped the entire system of the company from working. It wasn't just stealing data, it was shutting down all the systems of Sony. And the general understanding is that any US company, and probably any Norwegian company today, would be vulnerable to the exact same thing. If that amount of energy were deployed against any company, they would all fail and they would all completely be immobilized. The arms race that I was describing in terms of public safety and crime is also very much in effect here. We are improving even since Sony, we have developed and started selling, certain companies selling systems that actually are more safe, but still not safe enough. Meanwhile, particularly in Russia and Eastern Europe, there's tremendous criminal and governmental supported hacker networks that are really, really, really capable. The internet itself is probably not at risk at the moment, although it's often been asked, what if the 13 peering points were simultaneously attacked with state-of-the-art technology and with the support of a very powerful government, say Russia or China? If that were to happen, I'm not certain that the internet would continue to operate. I think that's unlikely, though.
Berit Svendsen, you mentioned it earlier. What would you say the things that Norway and Telenor should do to be more prepared in case of attacks?
Yeah, but I would just answer that question first, because when I was working at the research department in Telenor during the end of 1980s, we had a picture of Paul Spilling. He was a famous researcher at that time. And it was a picture of him disconnecting the internet from Norway because it was only one connection to internet. And that went into Telenor's R&D department. And that was easy to stop internet attacks at that time, and he really did. Nowadays, it's so widespread. There are so many connections into Norway, but there are some main connections. So Telenor has a special responsibility because we are the largest internet and mobile operator in Norway, and we will carry, all the bad things to companies and consumers and to government if there is an attack on Norway. So we are very critical in that situation, but the banks are critical. The EVRY is critical because they are doing everything for the banks regarding the IT systems. The government is critical, so we have to cooperate in the real time to prevent the attack and get rid of it. And we are not there yet.
When do we get there?
I don't know. We are not prepared to do it in real time. It's more that we are handling the attack, DNB is handling the attack, the government are collecting afterwards what did happen, instead of being there together with us. We have to learn, because if you know the attack, you are able to take it away. But if you don't know it, you have to analyze, you have to get information from abroad. What is this all about? How do we handle this attack to filter it out? So it's all about real-time preparedness, cooperation.
Eirik Newth.
Yeah, on the one hand, of course, it is very important to be prepared for these all-out attacks. And if you want to see a visualization of that, you can switch on to TV3 and watch Die Hard 4 whenever it's on. It shows what happens when you take down everything. I'm actually, yes.
Is that actually possible, the fire sale thing?
Yeah, I've seen some research that said, for instance, that yes, American power companies have been attacked. But I'm actually more concerned with the sort of general background noise. Yes, you might have this huge cyber attack, but rather this people experiencing, if they see an increase in this, for instance, attacks on our money supply, making things unsecure, taking computers hostage, which is a new thing, an erosion of trust. And that's important to all the businesses that operate on the internet, because you need people to trust, for instance, vital things like money supply. For instance, a few years ago, we had a huge spate of ATMs or cash machines being hacked by criminals, and I'm certain I was not the only one who stopped using them at that time, because I realized that there was a pretty good chance that if I took out money, cash in central Oslo, there would be a camera there and a scanner. So I stopped using them, and I was not alone, and actually they're now being phased out. And I'm more concerned with that than the big, huge cyber attack, the sort of general background noise, and the increase in the sort of the threat surface. I mean, the more gadgets we have, the more things that are online, the more possibilities you have for attack. There's actually a short story there. Michael Hayden, the former head of the NSA, according to Der Spiegel magazine, he was reportedly some years ago in Washington, D.C. and was buying a new cell phone with his wife. And a young guy came up to him in the cell phone store and said, here's the latest iPhone, it's brilliant. And one of the best things is that there's 400,000 apps there. And according to Der Spiegel, Michael Hayden turned to his wife and he said, he really doesn't know what I do, does he? Because to me, 400,000 apps is 400,000 possibilities of attack. and of course, he's right. I mean, the more things, the more apps we have, the more little things can happen to us. So I'm more worried by that than this sort of... it's good that we're prepared for the big one, but I think the smaller ones might be more important in the long run.
Maybe I ask you to be the devil's advocate, Eva Jarbekk, and say, don't we have to recognize and acknowledge these risks because that we are a free society and we can't surveil everything?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
That we have to recognize the risks, that we can't prepare for everything. That people also need to understand that.
We can't prepare for everything. But I know that we are trying to prepare both for the big thing. Many wise people are trying to find better ways of interacting than what we have seen. But I think it's also very important that we are putting the possibility just for the private companies so that they can maybe take care of the small things. Because I think government is focusing on the big issues naturally and rightfully. And in order to have security, data security in a smaller scale, it will have to be the private companies that are taking care of that. And I'm very much maybe a bit worried because what they can do is framed by legislation. And we are, in a way, quite restricted in Norway on what we can do today. Except that today we have, the privacy legislation it's EU-driven. And today it's a directive, which means that we can have more safety rules, and we have. I promise you, we have a lot more than, for instance, in the UK. You can do things in the UK you can't dream of here. And if you go to the US, it's different again. And now we're seeing the new legislation coming up, and that will not probably be a directive, it will be a regulative. And from a regulative, you can't add very much more security. There are some few exceptions. But it will have to be incorporated as is. And the interaction between the US and EU and how this is going to be interpreted is going to be a big, I was going to say headache, but I should say challenge.
Right.
For many years to come.
Right. Last question from the audience, and we have the final remarks afterwards.
Yes, hello, my name is Hilde. I'm from Abelia. It's actually a follow-up to what you just said, because one of the traits of Norwegians, we are really trustworthy, but also at the same time quite naive. I think it is the FBE boss who said that there are two social companies, those that have experienced an attack and know it, and those that don't. And how can we raise awareness and knowledge about these threats? Because it's not necessarily just attacks, but also based on human failure in companies. So it's about a question that is going to each and one of us, and how to raise awareness. Laws cannot solve everything. There is also awareness among people, and maybe less naivety.
So let's take that question with us, how to raise awareness among ourselves. I think we can go with Eirik Newth first. Any final thoughts? And also maybe answer the question how to raise awareness among ourselves?
I think the raising awareness thing might be my final thought, because that's what I'm all about. I mean, in my work, what I do is I write and I lecture, and I want to raise awareness about these things. And what I'm looking for is more people who are independent, actually. Not necessarily part of a business or part of a government agency, but simply more people out there who are interested and raise these questions. And also make use of their experiences, because that's an important contribution here. We all have experiences with what's happening now, and make use of them. And take part in the debate. Do it online, do it in all kinds of public spaces. Next time we talk about this here, you could raise your hand more often, for instance. So I think that will be my challenge to the audience. It's yours from now.
Eva Jarbekk, any final thoughts?
Yes, I think one of the key issues is knowledge. If you know what it is, you have some ideas what may be done. Challenge, of course, is that even a technologist doesn't necessarily agree with the other technologist of what works and what doesn't. But I see a very close connection between data security, privacy, technology. And even though there are some very good initiatives in educating young people in Norway, I also see some things that surprise me. For instance, when I was in the university, we had a very excellent professor, and we were taught privacy in Norwegian. Now they have a very excellent professor who is he's from Australia. They now have privacy education in English. That is perfect. But I'm not. Even though I think that it's a global society, I think maybe we should have this in Norwegian. I think it's a bit strange that it's not focused upon more, and that it should be present more places. But it's coming. You see a bit of both. But education is vital, and also the word that we had in Norwegian, tverrfaglig, that it's multi.
Cross-sectoral.
Yeah, you need to know a bit of many things. Yeah.
Berit Svendsen.
I think big data is here to stay. We need to be open and transparent about how to use it, both from the company side and from the government side. I think we need a faster legislation on the area, because the technology is moving so fast. And internet is the best and most important innovation in newer times. So let's keep it open. It's a huge task going forward.
David Kirkpatrick.
Well, the company that I run, Techonomy, is entirely devoted to trying to help leaders understand the role that technology is playing in business and society, and the reality is leaders generally don't understand it. My opinion is that every CEO and board of directors and senior managers, even mid-managers of every major company need to be participating in discussions like the one we have here today. But unfortunately, almost none of them are doing so, at least in my country. I mean, it's starting to change. I get the feeling that in Norway you're a little more sophisticated about some of these things and maybe you're better educated. I don't know. But American leaders are not willing to dive into these issues the way we have today, and that's very frightening to me. So it needs to happen more. It happens to be something that I'm personally devoted to, and we even have a conference the Techonomy is organizing for 3 weeks from now in Washington called Techonomy Policy, specifically to look at some of these things. So, you know, but there's a ton of work still to do with business leadership to help them understand what's going on.
Before we give the panelists a warm round of applause, I just want to mention that our next breakfast meeting is in cooperation with the Oslo Freedom Forum, which is Democracy in Decline, with Stanford professor Larry Diamond, Jonas Gahr Støre, and Kjell Magne Bondevik. So check into it on civita.no. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panel. Give them a warm round of applause.